Okay, let's start. 12:03. Are we on? Okay.
Yes.
Great, thank you. Okay, good afternoon, friends and colleagues, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to the Environment in Asia Research Series at the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard University. Welcome, you all. My name is Ling Zhang. I am an environmental historian of China. I teach Chinese history and environmental history at Boston College. I will be your moderator for today. Before introducing the event and our panelists, I would like to quickly introduce our series. Environment in Asia started in 2012. It was initiated by Professor Michael Muscolino when he spent that year at Harvard. Professor Muscolino is an environmental historian of modern China at the University of California, San Diego. In 2013, Professor Muscolino entrusted this series to me, along with his vision to advocate for Chinese environmental history. Ever since then, I've been convening this series, adding to it an interdisciplinary dimension and using it as a platform to bring together scholars from the humanities, the social sciences, the natural sciences, and sometimes we also have artists and creative writers. The goal here is to raise awareness of and generate interest in environmental studies within the broader field of Chinese studies and in East Asian studies. It is also to build a scholarly community so we know who's doing what, with what specialty, so we can establish communication with them and even seek collaborations with them. So now Environment in Asia is in its 9th year. So far, it has organized more than 30 research events and hosted more than 60 researchers. I think, given the continuous support from the leadership and the colleagues at the Fairbanks Center with the generous inputs from scholars across North America and scholars from Europe and Asia, I'm confident that our series will continue to grow. Indeed, we're now facing the unprecedented challenge. The COVID-19 pandemic forces us to give up travel, so we have to shut down all of our physical events. But I think this also offers us a rare opportunity. Online events like this one drastically expand our intellectual community across the virtual space. As I know, more than 200 people have registered for this event alone. So this is marvelous. The internet is now helping us to reach out to a far wider, much wider audience. So our message in regard to environmental studies, environmental history, in relation to Chinese studies and East Asian study can be heard by many more people. So I encourage you, our audience, to continue to follow us, follow our program in the future. Check out our future events on the Fairbanks Center's website. So I'm currently putting together another panel to address the issues on historical epidemics and public health in China. The details of that event will be provided quite soon. So now today, we're very, very fortunate to invite 4 excellent environmental historians here with us to speak for the panel, The River Dragon Has Indeed Come. For those of you who are familiar with the literature of water management, flood control, and hydroelectricity in modern China, you must know the panel seems to try to echo the title of a highly influential book, which is called The River Dragon Has Come, Three Gorges Dam and the Fate of China's Yangtze River. In that 1998 book features the writer and journalist Dai Qing, and the book's goal is to press questions upon humanitarian and environmental problems in regard to the construction of the Three Gorges Dam. 22 years after that famous book was published, in this so far still disastrous 2020, we realized that the river dragon has indeed come. And not a single dragon, but many of them. The expensive floods in China this year have affected more than close to, I think, 60 million people in 27 provinces, causing 158, perhaps more people to be missing or die. So our agenda today is to learn something about these floods and to reflect on the connections between these contemporary disaster events and the long-term historical disaster patterns. Our speakers today are Alejandrino, who teaches at Trinity College, Courtney, who teaches at Durham University in England, Xiangli, who teaches at Rhode Island School of Design, and Xiangli, who teaches at the University of Memphis. The panel will take the format of a series of conversations. At the end of it, it will leave out, I hope, 30 minutes for Q&A. So if you come up with questions, please type your question out, type them out in the Q&A section of this webinar. So if this is your first time to use a webinar, you can find a button called Q&A at the bottom of the webinar's window. Click it and you can pull out the Q&A. So I will moderate the Q&A section. All right, given all this, I'm gonna turn to our 4 speakers to ask them to quickly introduce themselves. How about we follow the order we put it on the website? Clark to go first, and then Chris, and then Xiangli and Yan.
Hi, I'm Clark Alejandrino. So as Ling mentioned, I teach at Trinity College, and my research is primarily in the area of climate history and animal history of China. And I'm currently revising a book manuscript on typhoons in the history of South China over the longue durée.
Hi, I'm Chris Courtney. I'm currently in the UK. I work at Durham University. I'm a social and environmental historian of modern China. So like many academics, I'm used to laboring in relative obscurity in kind of topics that are very niche. But unfortunately, I found myself relevant twice this year for bad reasons. So firstly, it's because I specialize on the city of Wuhan. Obviously, everybody knows that that's been become the center of the media spotlight since January. And also I researched the history of flooding in central China, and of course that being the topic of today's webinar. And I kind of published a book on that called The Nature of Disaster in China a couple of years ago. Okay, I shall hand over to Xiangli.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Hello, everyone. I'm Xiangli Ding. First, I would like to thank Ling for including me in this event. So I define myself as an environmental historian who works on 20th century China. I'm particularly interested in the rise of hydroelectricity. Currently, I'm working on a book manuscript about the rise of hydroelectricity and major hydropower project in China, which include but not limited on the first concrete dam on the Yellow River, Sanmensha hydropower project. So it examines the kind of reservoir displacement, environmental change, and many other social issues. I really look forward to our conversation today. Thank you.
Yan, you're muted.
Hi, I'm Yan Gao, and I'm a native of Wuhan, and for some reason, and many of my neighbors and friends started asking me, and finally knows about where I'm from. And so I'm a historian of late imperial and modern China, and I work at a juncture of social and environmental history, and I have been searching about the water management of the Middle Yangtze region, with a focus on the community initiatives of the environmental management. I am interested in issues such as human military impact on the environment and how ethnicities played out in their interactions with the local environment. And I have recently given my attention to the study of epidemic diseases. I'm currently finalizing my book manuscript and Yangtze waters and transforming the water regime in the Jianghan Plan of late imperial China. And I examined the community dike management, specifically polders, from a long-term perspective, and argue that changing water regime in the region acted as a contested domain and for state politics, community management, and environmental transformation. Thank you, everyone. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank all of you for getting together to to talk about these painful and yet significant issues. So let's talk about 2020 floods. How about all four of you gave us an education about what happened? Why did it happen? How have people been experiencing the floods? How the situation looks like on the ground? What are the significant issues we should pay special attention to? How about I call out Chris to begin with? Then I think Clark, Yan, and Xiangli can follow by adding more information.
Okay, thanks very much, Ling. So for me, like I guess many people here, I've been kind of digesting images of this flood from afar, right? I'm unable to go to China and kind of see what the situation is on the ground. But I've kind of been seeing some pictures of inundated communities, destroyed houses, all these kind of Song Dynasty bridges that have been destroyed, and all sorts of terrible things. And as somebody who researches the history of floods, these are all too familiar. So what I'd like to do in these initial comments is think a little bit about the ways in which the floods of 2020 represent a continuity with the past, but also to think about how it's actually a departure from the historical pattern of flooding in this region. And it's a continuity in the terms of the kind of physical impact of the flood, a departure in some ways in terms of the humanitarian impact of the flood. So beginning with the continuity, the kind of deep context for this, it shouldn't be surprising that there are floods in 2020, right? This region has been water abundant since before human beings were occupying this area. In fact, people have actually derived a number of benefits from this abundance of water. You can think of things like wet rice agriculture, pisciculture, all these kinds of ways of living with a water abundant environment. However, by the modern era, both kind of patterns of settlement and also the kind of unsustainable interventions into the river system that people have made ensured that people began to experience flooding as a kind of chronic problem. So you'd have flooding almost every year by the kind of 19th, 20th century, and then these big, spectacular mega floods that would strike every few decades. And so in the 20th century, we had, for the kind of big ones were in 1931, 1954, and 1998. So in a way, and you can see these are recurring every couple of decades, you would think 2020 floods actually fits quite nicely into this continuity, this historical pattern. Of course, the major distinction is the fact that this problem is supposed to have been alleviated by the construction of the Three Gorges Dam, which I'm not going to talk about because we have another speaker who's going to discuss that in greater detail. Suffice it to say, we already knew from extensive waterlogging in years like 2016 that this dam hadn't solved localized flooding. But we now know it's probably not also solved the problem with kind of regional kind of mega flooding, which I'm sure the engineers would debate. So in a way, we've got this kind of continuity with the past. At the same time, we do have a departure from the kind of the history of flooding as a humanitarian catastrophe rather than just as a hydrological event. So what do I mean by this? So I in no way want to minimize the misery that people are suffering in China at the moment. It's caused tens of thousands of homes to be destroyed. Billions of yuan have been knocked off the economy. It's already suffering because of coronavirus. So far, the death toll is in the hundreds, and that's tragic for all of the people who have lost their lives and their families. But if you compare it, say, for example, to the 1998 floods when more than 3,000 people died, then the 1954 floods when 150,000 people died, and then the 1931 floods when in excess of 2 million people died, you can see in humanitarian terms, this doesn't fit with this pattern. And I would argue that the fundamental difference, when we're looking at the history of flooding, there's a tendency to focus on the kind of hydraulic history. But the fundamental difference is actually the transformation of the epidemiological environment. Because what happens now with floods is they're not causing these horrific outbreaks of cholera, schistosomiasis, malaria, all of these things that really blighted the lives of Chinese people in the mid-20th century and really drove the mortality during these events. So I'll kind of round up my comments by saying when we're thinking about kind of the contemporary and historical problem of flooding, we need to pay attention not just to kind of dikes and dams, but also to pathogens and vectors and things like this that cause mass diseases in the aftermath of flooding.
Excellent comment. Now we're gonna move on to Clark.
So let me just share my screen. So I'm the climate historian on this panel. So I've been tasked to talk a bit about what's going on up in the air rather than down on the ground. And let me just start with what I think is the most easy to understand video about the Mayu front. And then I'm gonna go into some detail about what was in this video and speak about it in terms of climate history of the Mayu.
Now what's powering the Mayu front is moisture, and this really neat product. First thing is moisture. That's the tropic one.
Okay, and from there, let me just continue on. Sorry. So, of course, the most important component in these rains is the start of the Asian monsoon. And this is basically a seasonal prevailing wind pattern. Basically, it's a summer monsoon versus the winter monsoon. And here in the case of these floods, we're dealing with the summer monsoon. And it's powered primarily by differences in temperature and pressure gradients between the Asian continental landmass and the surrounding oceans. And knowledge of these prevailing winds have, of course, allowed people in the Indian Ocean to conduct maritime trade over the course of the last 2,000 years. And this, you can see on this slide that the oceans, the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean have been warming up significantly since May. And all this heat is driving the moisture laden air over these oceans into the Asian landmass. And you can see from this map from NOAA that, especially in the Indian Ocean, we have warmer than average sea surface temperatures in June and July. And these Indian Ocean sea surface temperatures, these warmer than average Indian Ocean sea surface temperatures, have what we call in climatology teleconnections. So these are climate anomalies that in far away places that are related to each other. And Indian Ocean sea surface temperatures, especially in this southeastern quadrant, when they're warmer than average, they usually correspond with a stronger Western North Pacific high here in this letter A over here, this circle, this anticyclonic letter A over here on the Philippines. And it also corresponds usually to greater precipitation over the Yangtze River and the Huaihe River Valley in China. And the reason for this is that Indian Ocean sea surface temperatures, when they're higher, they drive more moisture up into Southeast Asia and China. And this is accelerated by a very strong Western North Pacific high pressure area, which helps drive all that moisture into central China. Another factor we have to consider is the Tibetan Plateau and the westerly jet. And this is what actually marks the Mayi front, where the most heaviest rainstorms occur over central China. And this westerly jet is also seasonal. It occurs year round, but its location depends on the seasons. And during June, it's over north of the Himalayan plateau, and it drives into central China. The position, of course, varies every year. And it is this combination of moisture, low-level moisture coming in from the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean, and its interaction with the Tibetan westerly jet, which causes all of this precipitation over central China. So as these two different bodies of air collide in central China, it causes the moisture-laden air from the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean to rise and release its precipitation over the Yangtze River and the Huaihe River Valley. So you can see it's the westerly jet that also drives all of this moisture from central China all the way into Japan and Korea. And we know that torrential rains have occurred not only in India, thanks to the monsoon, and not only in China because of Meiyi, but also in Japan and Korea, where the Meiyi rain front extends thanks to the Tibetan Plateau westerly jet. The Western North Pacific subtropical high, of course, not only channels all of this moisture from the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean to China, but it also determines the Meiyi front and how far it gets into Northeast Asia, Japan, and Korea. This is a picture from the Chinese Meteorological Administration's website, as this is the way they understand the Meiyi front. And you can see all these elements, the moisture from the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean and the Tibetan Western Plateau as it creates this Meiyi front over the Yangtze and the Huaihe River Valley. And these are the kind of the result of the interaction of all these different climate systems is the torrential rain that we've seen between June and July of 2020. And there's a lot of work in paleoclimatology that is reconstructing how strong the monsoon and the Meiyi front has been in the past. In particular, I follow the one from the Tree Ring Laboratory in Columbia University, which gathers dendrochronologies from the tropical Pacific, the Indian Ocean, and in Tibet and China in order to reconstruct the strength of the monsoon and the Meiyi front throughout its history. And just to make a quick summary of what I've just said, historically, we're beginning to see an increasing trend of hotter Indian Ocean sea surface temperatures. This probably is a result of climate change and global warming, and which has led to more moisture coming. Historically, most of the moisture that goes to China comes from the South China Sea and the Pacific Ocean. But ever since 2000, we're seeing a trend where a lot more moisture is coming in from the Indian Ocean, and which corresponds also to a stronger Western North Pacific subtropical high, which funnels this moisture even faster into central China, hence thus increasing the amount of possible rainfall in the region. We are still conducting more research on the history of Meiyi and monsoon, and I'm confident that the natural archives of tree rings and geological proxies are going to give us a better sense in the future of Meiyi fluctuations in strength. But I also want to emphasize as a climate historian that climatological factors alone don't explain the unfortunate events of 2020, and we also need to factor in the human context. So off we go to the next speaker.
Yeah, okay. So Chris has introduced, we'll talk about the overview of the 2020 flood, the historical continuities, and the departure from the past. And Clark, thanks for the introduction about the monsoon season of this region for this year. And I will talk more specifically about the flood diversion strategies and how to solve the flood and what kind of solutions they have been implemented in order to fight off the floods. There are usually two immediate strategies, and in the situations of dikes overwhelmed by the excessive flood waters. And one is to utilize a group of reservoirs, and including dams that adjust the flood water level, and in the middle and downstream of the Yangtze River. And the other one is to utilize the flooding diversion areas, and it's called the Zhoutan Xinhong. And so I will show a map actually that is related with my hometown. share. Is it sharing? Okay, so the Zhoutan Mingyuan, also called the polders, and has a long history and played a very important role and in relieving the flooding pressure along the Yangtze. Historically, there were two systems of dikes, and in the middle Yangtze region, the Yangtze main dike, and along the main river course of the river, and the community dikes, and which we call the Mingyuan. And the main dikes of the Yangtze and the Han River dikes were funded by the government and are properly managed by both the government and the communities. And when floods struck the region, the most vulnerable areas actually were in the community dikes area. In 1998 flood, and more than 100 Mingyuan were flooded in order to relieve the water pressure from the main river water course. And they were either because of the overflow of the flood water, or they were intentionally destroyed and to letting the flood water into the communities. And so this year, when the water level of Wuhan rose to the number fourth historical high, and the several Mingyuan had to be flooded in order to protect the main dike of the Yangtze. So on July 12th, Tianxin Zhouyuan in the Yangtze was flooded. It's over here. Sorry. It's over here, and the Tianxin Zhouyuan, and was formed out of the sedimentation and from the upstream, and has been moving downstream for about 11 meters every year in the middle of the Yangtze River course. And within a week after the diversion of the Tianxin Zhouyuan and Dongfengyuan in this area, and the communities were evacuated, the people were evacuated to prep for the flood diversion during this time. So the same flooding actually was also happening in many other of the Mingyuan in the Jiangxi and Anhui provinces, and especially in the high water times and in the middle of July. And now it seems like in this area, actually the water is receding. In addition to the labors and the organizing and from the government, the military joined and in fighting off the floods, and we also see a strong initiatives from the local communities. And so the community people organized themselves and trying to protect the community dikes, and even after they were evacuated from the flood diversion areas. And they organized into kind of a dike watching teams called Shaobing. So it's kind of very, in a very military tone, and dividing responsibilities and to inspect the dikes, and which it has, we can find a lot of historical traces and back in history, and the similar practices were on, and just like the local communities, local initiatives to manage the dikes. And some families and to see multiple generations going on the dikes, and such a local initiative has always been a strong tradition in this area. So the community dikes usually are low and are lower and made of the earth, so they were easily to be saturated by the flood waters, and so they were constantly needing the attention from the people and to inspect and to maintain, and need a huge labor and to keep it intact. And so they use the flood diversion areas. They use as the flood diversion, and is a historical legacy and modern policy design. And some communities were ordered to retreat from the areas in order to better prepare for the flooding emergencies. And then the two types of retreats, the double retreat or single retreat. And so the double retreat are the people retreated, evacuated from the communities and the residential houses as well as their agricultural activities, but a single retreat. So they retreat from their residential houses, but they still maintain, they keep going back and to perform their agricultural activities. As far as the floods go for this year, and many cited that this time the floods were smaller in general, on a smaller scale than that in the 1998 floods, and the communities diverting the floods have played a critical role in the overall management of the current flooding situations. But from the local level, and the people suffer, and those are the aspect we should pay more attention to. Thank you.
Okay, can you all see it?
Okay.
Okay, good. Okay, thank you. I'm assigned to talk about the water management infrastructure, especially in South China. Well, there are thousands of dams in South China, so I'm not capable to cover all of them. And as a historian, my knowledge, I have to admit that my knowledge about the engineering and hydrological aspect of those dams are limited. But speaking of water management infrastructure, you must curious about the role of the Three Gorges Dam in this year's flood, right? Because it was completed in 2009, now it's 2020. There are still severe floods in South China. And why is this so? So to understand it, I think we have to take a look at the Yangtze River water system map, as I show it here. So the dam is located on the kind of upper stream of the Yangtze River. So it can only control flood water from the upper stream, while can do very little about flood in the middle and lower reaches of the Yangtze River, especially those tributaries in Hunan and Jiangxi provinces. And that's what I see this year, those kind of regional floods in those part of the South China. And also the kind of misunderstanding of the so-called omnipotence of the Three Gorges Dam, I think we can partially attribute it to the kind of exaggeration of the flood control capacity in the initial proposal of the Three Gorges Dam in the 1980s and 1990s. Well, but to be fair to the project, I think the dam does also contribute to the flood control of the Yangtze River by mitigating the peak flows, especially from the upper stream. In doing so, it kind of lowers the risk of dike failures in the downstream, especially in Hubei province. So usually the regular water level of the Three Gorges Reservoir is around 175 meters above the sea level. According to state requirement, it has to lower its water level to around 145 meters before each flood season. So that to make enough room for the upcoming flood water during flood seasons. But of course, in the meantime, it would compromise part of its hydroelectricity generation capacity. Speaking about the kind of the anxiety about the possible dam failures in the air, I think that concern is understandable, but should not be exaggerated. We know that in history, there was a dam failure in 1975 in the upper reaches of the Huai River in southern Henan, my home province. So the so-called Banqiao and Shimantan dam fissure. So that dam fissure caused the deaths of around 100 to 240,000 people because of flood and also the disease following the flood. So that was one of the most devastating kind of dam fissure in human history. I think a few years ago, there was also a dam fissure in California. And this year, I think in May, there were dam fissures in Michigan, in the United States. So that concern is, that is real. But I also want to talk a little about the reported dam deformation. Well, that is not new this year, but actually a report from last year. I think the Chinese authority has kind of clarified and saying that the dam is in good shape and safe. So instead of worrying about the kind of possible dam failures, I think we also need to pay more close attention to the silting problem and the reservoir displacement programs. So to conclude, I think I want to say that dams alone would not solve the flooding problem in China. Especially when we consider, when we think about the technological lock-in and the population density in South China. So to be more practical, I think in addition to dams, there are just so many have been built and it's hard to kind of decommission them. So a viable flood control system should consist of, flood diversion or storage basins, those kind of dikes, as well as a resilient wetland system, which is lacking in contemporary China. Thank you, Ling.
Hello. Can you hear me? Oh, so yeah. For some strange reason, I couldn't hear Xiangli for the past 1 minute. But anyhow, I'm here, back. Great. Thank you guys so much. I really love the ways in which all of you construct your talk and you bring in different perspectives. Chris began by bringing us all the way back to pre-modern era. Then Clark basically flight all of us up to the air. Then Yan and Xiangli help us to reground ourselves, right? Zoom in to a local community, how to deal with the local level issue by organizing themselves. And then Xiangli bring us to the center of our anxiety, whether or not the Three Gorges Dam gonna collapse or not, right? So anyhow, wonderful introduction to the 2020 situation. This is, I believe our audience know that this is a very general introduction. By no means we can cover all the ground, so you can contact our speaker to zoom in, right, to ask more questions. But now I want to switch our attention to reorientate us back to more historical background, to connect with the historical depth. All of us here sitting here are three speakers are environmental historians, and then they have they're going to bring in more of their specialty to compare what's the similarities and what's the differences between what they see this year and then from the longer historical past. I'm gonna call out Clark first to begin this part of a conversation. And then we will be followed by Yan, and then Chris, and then again, and with Xiangli, because you are our contemporary person.
Okay. So let me again. So Ling asked us to reflect on what we see, what we're seeing right now with our own research interests. Unfortunately, I do South China and not Central China. And though I'm interested in cultural history, I think Chris and Yan probably know more about the ways in which floods and people's cultures and lives have been shaped in this region of China more than I do. But I study typhoons in South China and the flood, and of course also the floods that come with typhoons over the course of the last 1,500 years. And I tend to see things over the longue durée. And typhoons and floods are both, in a sense, natural disasters. And one of the things that I've become really interested in looking at these floods and the way they've been managed is the way that disasters and legitimacy, the political legitimacy, are very closely intertwined. For any of you who do Chinese history, especially Chinese environmental history, you will know that in many ways, natural disasters have been very much tied to the Chinese state since the beginning of Chinese history, from the Mandate of Heaven. But as I've studied typhoons in South China from the 5th century to the 20th century, one of the things I noticed is that the state has been increasingly become involved in the management of disasters. And in a way, the management of disasters, I would argue, is becoming an increasingly important part of the state's narrative of its legitimacy. And so I just want to give a quick kind of explanation of what I mean by this in terms of the floods and my own research in typhoons. So we know that imperial dynasties like the Qing dynasty very much exerted a lot of effort into disaster relief. I show you here a portion of a memorial at Zhouzhe from the first historical archives in Beijing, and this is from my own research. This is a memorial reporting a typhoon disaster in Guangdong in South China, and the local officials' efforts to relieve the flooding and the suffering caused by the typhoon. And you have the Qianlong Emperor writing in vermilion ink about how if all of my officials were as conscientious as you, then my people would not suffer so much. And so there, we see in my book manuscript, I argue that the state, as it entered into South China, increasingly increased its ability to manage disasters and to penetrate society through disaster management. And so prior to the Qing dynasty, there was a lot of descriptions of typhoons, but not really a lot of things that the state could do in order to manage typhoons. But Qing dynasty, you have as many Chinese historians would know, the ever normal granary system was put into motion in order to help alleviate disasters like typhoons. Qing also did some kind of ritual management. So in my research, I found that along the Guangdong coast, the Qing government set up a network of wind god temples to help manage typhoons ritually. And this is a picture that I took in 2016 when I visited Leizhou Peninsula in South China and witnessed this village marching out its wind god, which dates to the Qing dynasty, and in a procession. By the 20th century, the state really gets very much involved in disaster management thanks to modern tools like meteorology and the Mao state's ability to penetrate local society. Disaster management becomes increasingly politicized, and people are mobilized, so mass mobilization in order to fight nature, to fight typhoons. You know, Judith Shapiro's famous book, Mao's War Against Nature. And here I have a picture of propaganda in Guangdong, where people are asked to fight typhoons and protect dikes and dams with their own bodies, linking their arms and hands in order to combat nature. So after the Mao period and the post-Mao era, people no longer were mobilized to do this the way that Mao did it. Instead, the People's Liberation Army has taken over many of these tasks that people were originally mobilized to do under Mao. So we, whether it's a 2008 Sichuan earthquake or all kinds of disasters after 1980, we increasingly see the greater role that the PLA has taken in terms of managing disaster. And as we know, the PLA is, of course, an extension of the Chinese Communist Party. So it serves as an effective kind of propaganda machine for demonstrating the efficacy of the Communist Party state. When I did my research in China in 2016, it coincided with the 40th anniversary of the Tangshan earthquake, the disastrous Tangshan earthquake of 1976. And I watched with great interest on CCTV Xi Jinping's visit to Tangshan on July 28th of 2016. And these are some images from that visit where he's talking to survivors of the earthquake. And what really caught my attention was the way in which Xi and the Communist Party really tied their legitimacy, at least one aspect of their legitimacy, to the Communist Party state's ability to manage disasters. So this is from that trip to Tangshan, where he taught. I wasn't able to translate this for this, but basically for those who can read Chinese, he's basically saying here that the ability to manage disasters is basically a very good way of measuring the capability and leadership of the government. And so he's basically tying the legitimacy of his the Communist Party towards its ability to its ability to manage natural disasters. And I've seen this trend increase over the course of 1,000 years of Chinese history. And it's the same as well for the 2020 floods. So I've been very much interested in the official pronouncements and the way that the government has not only responded physically, but the way it's projecting its image and reinforcing its legitimacy through its work managing these 2020 floods. So you have very similar kinds of pronouncements from Xi Jinping during and in the wake of these 2020 floods. And kind of the argument I want to make is that though the recent floods do pose an additional challenge, especially in light of COVID-19, and if you go online and you Google, people will say, oh, how unlucky China is, you just had a coronavirus, how unlucky Wuhan is, and now it has to deal with these floods, and then you have locusts and things like that. But the way I see it is that I think probably in Xi's mind, he also sees this, and the Communist Party is also an opportunity for them to reassert their narrative of legitimacy. So the floods, I see this as an opportunity for them to demonstrate how Chinese socialism, or socialism with Chinese characteristics, works, and that the party handles disasters effectively. And this is especially important in light of the fact that China's received a lot of criticism, both locally and internationally, over the way it has handled the COVID-19, the virus. And so I think these floods is a way of not only distracting people from what happened there, but actually it's a way of saying, look, we actually handle these things well, and that's why you should support us. So kind of my closing reflection is that disaster management in Chinese history has increasingly become a tool for the Chinese state to assert its legitimacy and expand its influence in society.
Okay, thank you, Clark. And yeah, so since I'm in the late imperial modern China, and so I will just go to the basics, talking about the historical roots of the current floods. And the first one is land reclamation, and there are several main trends of land reclamation, start with the military initiative in the 13th century, and the defense of the Mongols in the middle Yangtze region, and the migration of the people into the region, and in the 15th and the 16th century and the 18th century population growth had stimulated a large scale of land reclamations. And the people drained the waterways and the lakefront, and to build the polders, they started a type of amphibians lifestyle in the polders. And so they will usually conduct the rice cultivation and doing the fishing, and there were complementary lifestyle in the region. And however, with more and more wetlands, became more and more reclaimed and turned into agricultural fields, and such amphibians lifestyle and was not sustainable anymore. And so the severe shrinkage of the wetlands in the area has definitely taken a heavy toll on the overall river lake system of the region. The second, the sedimentation, largely related with the river geomorphological movement. And so upstream mountain region, and first take several centuries, and the Shek people opened up the forest land in the upstream of the river, and the deforestation led to increased sedimentation in the downstream rivers, compounded with the geomorphological movement of the river, and the sediment had been such a problem for the central Yangtze, the Yangtze in the middle stream, and the Yangtze River had become a suspending river. And so there's a pagoda in the Jinzhou area, was built in the 1500s. And so over the centuries up until now, it's sink 7.5 meters. As we can see, if you enter into the pagoda and you have to go down the stairs and then go into the pagoda. So that is one manifestation of the geomorphological movement of the river and with the surrounding environment. And the third, the environmental justice. And in history, then have always been an issue in the flood management in this region. And because of the political reasons, such as ancestor tombs, protect ancestor tombs of high officials, or the critical location of the government offices. And the government had always been favoring the one side of the riverbank over the other. So as we can see, there's one side of the riverbank has been continuously strengthened and was properly managed and divided into different sections and assigning officials and assigning funds. And so that side of the river bank was never flooded and was continuously go along with the growth of the dike. The dike was building higher and higher and become stronger and stronger. On the other side of the river, and was called the Zhoutan Xingyuan, Zhoutan Xinhong. So they were loosely managed by the communities. And they were, when the flood waters came, and those communities were doomed and they were flooded. And so it's kind of one bank over the other, the favoritism in terms of geography of this area. So this issue, overall landscape and the waterscape of the Zhanghan Plain was changed from the long term in the long run. And after thousands of years embankment, and the current dikes reached 10 to 15 meters higher than the surrounding areas along the river and the channel bank. And this embankment had largely leveled up the river channel. That's increased the river bed and making the Yangtze a suspending river. And the Zhanghan Plain was called the Leatherland in central China. And largely due to the heightened dikes and the suspending river and its large flat lowland areas and with extensive dike management. So, so the average level of the plain, actually, if you look at the ground level of the plain, the Zhanghan Plain now, it was lower than the bottom of the Dongting Lake, so surrounding areas. And the geologists were also talking about the seesaw geography, geological landscapes in this area as the river. In the middle, the Yangtze River as the seesaw, the plank, and with one side of the Zhanghan Plain and with the Dongting Lake as two sides of the seesaw. So that geology, landscape, and the waterscape of this area actually turned this region actually exceptionally lowland and frequently inundated and had severe of the drainage problems, became the water bag, and because water cannot go away in these areas. So different historical drives and the flooding and drainage problems, what deeply entrenched in the historical policies, practices, and human activities of this region. And one might say that the flooding, the flood diversion communities could also pose the similar environmental justice issue at the present. Thank you.
Okay, where am I going? Hopefully you can now see my screen. Okay, well, it's really great for Yen to wrap up the way she did, and I'm kind of building on what she said just now and also in her first introduction, thinking about this issue of flood diversion, the kind of deliberate sacrificing of one area in order to save another. And it's kind of illustrative of the way that one of the things I find interesting about flooding is it has the capacity to create these really kind of toxic zero-sum political kind of dynamics between different communities. And I know Yen's written about that in kind of the context of the kind of deeper history, how communities get pitted against each other, because water control can be a bit of a zero-sum game in terms of I flood my community in order to your community in order to save mine. And as we know, as Yen already mentioned in her first comments, this kind of flood diversion tactic has been used extensively in the response to the 2020 floods. So she was talking about Dongxi Lake and Tianxingzhou here in Wuhan. The kind of it's one of these polders, right, that Yen's been talking about, was deliberately flooded in order to try and protect other areas of Wuhan. You can see from the map, this area is relatively underpopulated, but there are people who live there, and it doesn't come as a surprise probably to find out they weren't particularly pleased about this this strategy of inundating this particular area. But this, together with the construction of these rather extensive kind of flood defense areas that was sent by a friend of mine in Wuhan, did manage to so far prevent the widespread inundation of Wuhan. They've suffered only kind of relatively little in comparison to other cities that have experienced much worse. Possibly some people have suggested more effort was put into defending Wuhan because of what they've just gone through with coronavirus. But the strategy of flooding areas in order to save Wuhan reminded me immediately of what happened during the 1954 floods. So the 1954 floods, here you can see a image taken in a relatively close by to the image of what I was just showing you, that guy building that flood defense here. So it's the kind of riverbank area in Hankou, the Hankou area of Wuhan, and with a very iconic maritime customs building in the background. And much, as Clark was saying in his talk about kind of the legitimacy of the state being predicated on their capacity to prevent disasters. In 1954, this was extremely prevalent in all of the kind of propaganda and all the kind of representation of this disaster. And it's this kind of, as Clark mentioned, this kind of millennia of history of using disasters as a tool to kind of bolster legitimacy. But in 1954, of course, it's also ramped up by the fact this is a nascent communist regime that's taken over from the Kuomintang, whose failure is represented in the bottom photograph that we can see there. So the same view in 1931, when the city was inundated. So in the kind of politics of Hubei, protecting Wuhan from flooding has become a major marker of regime legitimacy for the Communist Party. And here we can see another kind of representation of flooding at this particular time. Again, you can see the iconic maritime custom building in the background. And it's got it's basically a mother fish talking to its children. And the small fish says, "Didn't you say that when there was a flood, we could go and play in Hankou?" And the big fish says, "Oh, that was in 1931. That couldn't possibly happen nowadays," suggesting that under the new regime, that couldn't possibly happen. So indeed, it is true that much of Wuhan was not flooded in 1954. It's not entirely true. So, for example, Wuhan is made up of 3 cities. The city of Hanyang was extensively flooded during that year, and much of it was also kind of deliberately flooded. It was kind of flooding was allowed to go into Hanyang. It wasn't quite used as a kind of flood detention basin, but it was kind of allowed to go into Hanyang in order to kind of concentrate resources on saving the economically more important parts of Wuchang and Hankou. So that's kind of one way they did it, but the kind of massive way that they managed to save Wuhan in 1954, supposedly, was through the use of this Xinjiang flood diversion, which is kind of a massive version of a flood detention basin that Yen was talking about in central Hubei province. So that it's kind of this big sluice gate that allowed the Yangtze River to flow onto the floodplains. This is touted as a kind of great modern invention that was going to allow the Communist Party to totally manage floods. In fact, there had been sluice gates since as early as the Song Dynasty to kind of do similar sort of releasing water during high flood peaks. They'd actually allowed them to silt up during the Ming Dynasty. So they rebuilt they built these new detention basins in 1952, and then in 1954 they allowed the water to flow onto the plains 3 times in order to try and prevent flooding downstream, particularly the flooding of the important economic center of Wuhan. And at the time, this was depicted as the rural population voluntarily allowing their villages to be flooded, thereby sacrificing their well-being in order to save the city. Quite how much you can say somebody voluntarily allows the government to inundate their community is a question I can leave with you. The other kind of major issue that's surrounding this flood diversion in this year, however, was the fact that it was inundating an area that was supposed to have been evacuated, but it was not properly evacuated. There's numerous reasons for this. I won't go into all of them. One of the kind of major reasons, however, was the fact that the rural populations living in this region, having just gone through land reform, were extremely reluctant to leave their land. People are always reluctant to leave during flooding, right? So in Tianxingzhou in Wuhan this year, people didn't want to leave, apparently, is what I've heard from reports, people in the city. But this year, in particular, people were saying, if we leave our land, you're going to take it away from us. And they were thinking that the government were going to use this as a tool to collectivize certain amounts of land, which was actually quite prescient because they did do that later in the 1950s. So they didn't leave. The evacuation was delayed, and eventually when people were kind of moved out into refugee camps, the refugee camps had not, this is all kind of based on kind of very selective cadre reports that were written at the time, but as far as I have been able to reconstruct it, it seems that the refugee camps had not been adequately prepared, and you again have this outbreak of disease happening. As I mentioned before, the epidemiological environment created a disaster out of this flood. So the official statistics for the 1954 flood claim that around 30,000 people died. Internal disaster investigations in the Hubei Provincial Archives say that 149.5 thousand people died. And of these, you can see here, 104,000 of these are in the Jingzhou area, which was part of the area where people were being displaced by flood detention. So really, this, I think, is a kind of represents, I don't think this is a kind of act of despotism. Nobody did this on purpose, but it really does demonstrate what happens when this policy of flood detention goes wrong on a kind of mass scale. So just coming back to something that Xiangli was talking about, how the fixation on looking at, is the Three Gorges Dam going to breach? Is it going to stretch? I think this is a very important point. We need to continue concentrating on this, but we also need to pay attention to this policy when we're thinking about the kind of the political dimensions and the humanitarian dimensions of flooding in China, of precisely what Yen was talking about in terms of this deliberate inundation of particular areas as flood detention basins, and make sure that we pay attention to the humanitarian consequences, because the experience of 1954 shows that this can go severely wrong. Okay, that's all I have to say.
Okay, can you all see it? Ling, can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Good.
Yeah, it works.
Okay, so basically would echo Yan and Chris' discussion on environmental justice and the humanitarian consequence of flood throughout Chinese history. So to make some kind of connections between my own research and flooding this year in China, I would like to kind of compare my study of reservoir displacement related to the three Gates Gorge, the Sanmensha hydropower project on the Yellow River in the 1950s, with the Huai River evacuation, flood division basin evacuation this year in Anhui. So in the 1950s, the reservoir displacement in Henan, Shanxi, and Shanxi lead to the displacement of more than 400,000 residents in that region. And because of the loss of farmland and properties, so it's lead to long-term impoverishment of those communities. And I see kind of similarity, between the 1950s and today. In Anhui, kind of frequent flood diversion has kind of constrained the local economic development and improvement of people's living standard, especially in the Huai River Valley. So in both cases, my own study of the 1950s and this year, we can see that state medias and the Chinese authority kind of promoted the principle of sacrifice the minority for the good of the majority, or sacrifice individual homes for the good of the collective or for the good of the country, right? So that kind of value and principle, in many cases, I think stand and are needed in the state of emergency and disaster. But we should, pay very close attention to the kind of humanitarian and economic consequences of those kind of values or decisions. This year, in one interview of many of those evacuees in Anhui, so one of senior ladies said that, although we felt bad about losing our property, human life is more valuable than property. Well, no matter we believe it's kind of propaganda or not, I do kind of respect the spirit and the sacrifice of those evacuees. But I would like to add that everyone's property is property, and their economic loss should be fairly kind of considered, should be fairly compensated. While the current policy, at least in the Huai River Valley, would only compensate 50 to 70% of the crop loss caused by flood diversion in those basins. Property damage, aquaculture, stuff like fish, crawfish, or ducks, and other economic losses are not covered by the current policy. And even worse, I think we should also realize not only those basins, those state-designated basins are flooded, but their neighboring communities, which are not considered at the designated diversion basins, also suffer. And their economic loss are basically not covered by the policy because they are not considered as part of the designated diversion basin. So, kind of also as an alternative plan or as a kind of long-term plan, the government proposes to resettle those communities to kind of other places. That happened in the 1950s during the Mao year. Mao and other kind of, and his father proposed that China should resettle people from populated areas or especially from Eastern and Central China to the frontier region. And today we see that kind of very similar proposal. But of course, today, because of financial and the lack of land resources, that plan is kind of very hard to implement. And also, the kind of demographic engineering policy during the Mao years, in many cases, not all of them, but in many cases failed. So we can see, kind of many similarities between the 1950s during the Mao year and the this year. So in other words, I think those rural areas, especially rural areas, the kind of discrepancy between cities and countryside in China, those rural areas are sacrificed to protect cities along the kind of lower stream of the Huai River. And I call for kind of policies to compensate for the short term, not only the short term, but the long term loss of those communities more fairly. In particular, I think those protected cities along the downstream should pay for the loss of those rural communities. Okay, Ling.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, our speakers. You really brought extremely rich insights based on your private, your personal research into this picture of ongoing disasters in China. So you brought up a lot of things, but we run out of time. So we have a precious 15 minutes left for Q&A. So I've collected many excellent questions from our audience. I don't believe we can cover all of them. So if we cannot cover your question, excuse us. You know how to contact our speakers. You may address your questions directly to all of them or each of them. But I'm going to bring up some questions here. So I'm just going to let four of you to jump in here. Okay, so first question is from our friend and colleague, David Pierce. David has some technical questions. So David says specifically to Clark, if Clark didn't mention anything in this regard, could Clark comment on whether or not there was an unusually large snowpack melt in Yangtze River source area this year? And all of you, if you know something, jump in.
So there are many factors that go into these floods. Snowpack melt certainly is one of them. But I think this year, in terms of at least my judgment of the reports, the climatology, the meteorology, the biggest factor is the increasing amount of moisture that came in from the Indian Ocean, which exacerbated the already usual amount of moisture that comes in from the South China Sea and the Pacific Ocean. So to me, snowpack melt might have been a factor, but it wasn't the big factor climatologically in exacerbating the rainfall and the floods this year.
Anyone would like to jump in? Or otherwise, we will have time to move on to another question. That's great. Okay, we have a question coming from, again, our colleague and friend, Steve Harrow. Steve says, as I understand 1998 floods, the main weather issue was not local rains, but rather 8 upstream flood surges. Were the weather patterns different in 2020?
Well, so as I mentioned, every disaster is in a sense different. There are some similar factors coming in, but perhaps in 1998 it might have been the snow melt and the surge in upriver. This year, 2020, it was mainly from increased moisture from the oceans. So it's really each disaster has to be taken differently, even if some of these factors might seem similar.
As I understand it, there was also quite a lot of problems, particularly with the Poyang Lake area, kind of further downstream, causing, I don't know if Yen's about to discuss this as well, causing further downstream flooding, localized rain in that area. I haven't followed the kind of meteorological dimensions of this particular year that closely, but that certainly seems to have been a factor, no?
And I think 98 and 2016, definitely El Nino was a factor. This year, not as much.
Yeah, I was told by an engineer and well, kind of participated in the dam construction along the Yangtze. And this year, actually, the rainfall in the area, regional rainfall, was a big factor in causing the flood, as opposed to the 1998 flood, and that is all entire Yangtze watersheds, and yeah, pose a big threat and to the flooding situation in the area.
Great. Let's quickly move on. So we have a question from our friend and a colleague who dying all the way from India. So right now, this is after midnight there, right? So Arup, this is your question. Do we have any estimate of a total annual share of China's GDP in flood control and the related expenses, disaster relief? Do we have a GDP number, things like that? Okay, we don't know. We will look into it. Thank you for a good question. All right, next question. Again, our friend Arunab Ghosh right now is in India as well, way after midnight. So, okay, Arunab said, hi all, thanks for the discussion. I'm wondering if the panelists could comment on the category or definition of quote unquote people affected. New reports speaks of 60 million affected because of the recent flooding. I have also seen reports that explain this by stating that this estimate is arrived at by totaling the population of districts affected by flooding, not an actual account of people directly affected. So what is the history of such a category definition? What exactly is at stake here? Politically, technically, how does this compare to the practices in other countries? It's a huge question. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, I will just quickly jump in, and I know a little bit of details, but I don't know about the categorization of the people that were affected and how they were categorized and they were counted. But in terms of flood diversion area, Tianxin Zhouyuan, they evacuated 457 people and from the area. And for the Dongshan Yuan of the Dongxihu district, that's close to my home, and that is they evacuated about more than 100, I think, people from the area. That's what they counted as kind of the people that were directly affected. And those people were relocated to different schools and were the other villagers and related family members, and so those people, I don't know if they were counted or not, and I have no idea. So definitely those people and the counting of those people, and we need to look more into it.
It's a really great question, because this is the slippery statistic, right, within all of these historic statistics. And they were certainly doing it in the 1950s, right, this disaster affected population. What the hell does it mean? Again, I think it's precisely as you suggest, they're kind of calculating the number of districts that are affected and calculating the population of that district and suggesting that this is the number of people who've been affected. What does affected mean? I mean, affected can mean like drowned. Affected can mean you lost a field of rice. It is a very, very slippery term. Unfortunately, in lots of the kind of statistics, it's the only thing you have to go by, the kind of death toll or the kind of flood affected population. It's the most human of the statistics that we have, but it is very, very problematic.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think one way to look into it probably is to check the website or the kind of publications of many river commissions in China, and how those river commissions kind of connected with the local authorities who are on the kind of front line of flood control. But I don't know I don't have a kind of answer to that question, but I think that is one way to look into it.
Great. Okay, can we move on to another question? This question is from a colleague named Alex Xiangli. So the question is, has anyone looked into how factors such as urbanization and a road construction, for instance, decrease in permeability might affect flooding? Also, many attribute the severity of the 1998 floods to massive deforestation in Western regions. So now with the institution of a reforestation plans such as SLCP following the 1998 floods, have we seen any measurable results in the current floods? Or perhaps it's too difficult to isolate contributing factors, but yeah. Deforestation, afforestation, are we getting better?
I would say I mean, obviously deforestation has a terrible effect on downstream flooding. Deforestation is also, I mean, looping back to the first part of the question, it is also a convenient scapegoat to look at a kind of to kind of focus on one particular factor and ignore things like, precisely as you suggest, the covering of surfaces with concrete and all these kind of other factors that can exacerbate localized flooding in particular regions. And I think this kind of blaming deforestation as a singular factor has a very long history in China. It kind of goes back to kind of blaming people who are settling up in forested areas for flooding downstream, which is a way, or which I always interpreted as a way of kind of blaming a singular factor for the fact that people who were also kind of empoldering land and doing all these things downstream were also exacerbating the problem of flooding. So I really think that deforestation is a very important point, but we shouldn't necessarily think that afforestation is going to solve flooding, because there's so many different factors at play.
Yeah, so definitely deforestation had played a very important role in increased riverbed downstreams, and as I discussed earlier. And but I would echo Chris about dripping down into one factor, single factor of leading to the floods. And there are multiple factors that lead into it's very complicated phenomena and leading to the kind of a disaster event. And so we are just need to be very cautious and not to be reducing to one factor, or either it's deforestation or it's dam construction and into the flooding situation. And also urbanization is closely related with the land reclamations and the turn to rural areas into the urban areas, but that's also has the initiative for the Sponge City initiative, and thank you, Chris, for mentioning that. And so the cities has a kind of different project and trying to has a kind of the implementation of different the facilities and to help the rainwater to go away and smoothing the drainage of the cities. And so again, very complicated issues, and definitely need more to look into.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have a precious 4 minutes, and I'm going to reserve this 4 minutes, the last question, basically, to our beloved friend and colleague, Peter Perdue. So Peter says, one of the causes of a severe flooding in the middle Yangtze is the reduction in capacity of the large lakes like Dongting and Boyanghu, and the disappearance of hundreds of smaller lakes. Long ago, I did some work that found this was a factor in increased flooding in Hunan, in 19th century. Has the government recognized this factor and made an effort to restore the capacity of these lakes? And I recall many of you mentioned the shrinkage of wetland, all these issues, right?
Yeah, so I would quickly just mention about the flood restoration and the flood plan restoration. in the area, in the Dongting Lake area. And then there had been policies and returning the land into the lakes and in the Dongting area. And so the flood diversion areas actually and also were retreating the people, withdrawing the people out of the flood diversion area, because so letting the flood water to pass through. And so I just mentioned about the Shuang Tui and Dan Tui, so double retreat and the single retreat. And so double retreat and the people completely retreat from the area. So they clear the way for the flood waters. And the single retreat is people still conduct the agricultural activities in the area, but they did not live there anymore. So there are policies implemented and trying to clear the way for the flood water and restore more healthier river lake systems. But the land reclamation shrinkage of the lakes has been so severe in history. And so we will see it will take a long time to restore.
I also want to add that actually the Three Gorges Dam exacerbated the shrinkage of wetland, exacerbated especially the shrinkage of Poyang Lake in Jiangxi. I think that's also kind of depend on the frequency of flooding in those areas, right? The Shuangtui and Dantui. Many people know that those areas would be flooded or could be flooded, but again, many of them do not have a better choice because of the limited farmland in other parts of China. So it has become a kind of new normal for those people to occupy, retreat, and reoccupy that area. Follow the pace of the river and the lake.
Okay. Any last word before we close up? Wow. Fantastic, wonderful job. I would like to thank our panelists for offering us extremely complex views about the now ongoing, but 2020 floods and then their connections with historical disaster, catastrophic events and patterns, right? And I think we can agree what this panel contributes to our knowledge and our awareness is things are complicated. We need to look really into the deeper historical times, and we need to travel up in the air, down into the water, right? To go down to the local communities, really to do all sorts of research in order to piece together different messages. So I think the contribution is to remind us not to generalize flood events like this and just to attribute it to one single factor. That is the kind of work we environmental historians are here to do, right? I really appreciate your participation and wonderful colleagues and friends who are here on the webinar with us. If you have other questions, more questions, including the questions we were unable to answer, please contact our scholars here, our panelists, and then all of them are writing new books and they're gonna come out soon. Please follow their research and learn from them. Thank you so much for your participation. We will see you again.
Thank you, Ling.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ling.
Thank you all. I really appreciate it.